Hi, Wawa, Renata. We're so glad that you could join us today. So this panel is the gendered climate battle, and we really want to focus on how we know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change. But it's really interesting because both of you have taken a very broadly speaking similar approach to the problem, which is to get more women and girls involved in the climate sector. So they are not just the victims, but they are there making changes, being in the room, making sure that women and girls are being considered when these decisions are taken. I just wanted to ask if you could just explain how exactly you go about doing that and what inspired your activism. Renata, do you want to start?
Definitely. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with the amazing Wawa and Sharon. Gender and climate is the issue in my heart. When I started my activism at 18 years old, I think I was just in the right place, right time. It was 2015. Paris Agreement was happening, COP21. I got to go with the government of Brazil, which is where I'm from. And it was just a really important moment in time, right? We talk to this day about the Paris Agreement. It's this landmark agreement that all countries have agreed about what they're going to do about climate change. And coincidentally, I sat in the gender negotiations room. I was so excited to see the gender equality discussions, climate justice, beyond the Paris Agreement. But actually, what I saw happen was the opposite. It was diplomats saying, you know what, this is not super relevant to our government's climate policies. We don't really see the connections. And I was really appalled by that. And as I looked around, I didn't see a lot of Brazilian people, a lot of Latin American, a lot of women, a lot of people of color. And I started making the connections. What does it mean to have people in power that are diverse, that are bringing their lived experiences to such powerful spaces like a COP, right? Things have gotten better a little bit, but still, imagine this. Paris Agreement, almost 10 years ago, what was decided then is still what we're discussing now. And so that inspired me to go back home, go back to Brazil, and really bring this agenda to the local level. Talk to people, hey, this is happening at the global level. Gender and climate is a real connection. At the end of the day, climate change is about people. It's impacting everyone, but as we know, the most marginalized communities are affected first. But if we don't know how this is happening at the global stage and how we can advocate for our stories, for our lived experiences there, then there's no use in terms of solving climate change with justice at the forefront. So a couple years later, I founded a project that then became an organization called EmpoderaClima. It means Empower for Climate in Portuguese or Spanish. And the idea was very simple. Let's talk about it. Let's educate young people specifically about what's happening so they can be then empowered to go into these spaces, knowing about what they're talking about, knowing what are the specific, very difficult, complex clauses of something like the COPs, with the agency that they should have, that they can have because of their background. So a lot of my work has been on translating a lot of the content. 1% of Brazilians speak fluent English. It's a country of over 200 million people. So how can you get people that are so impacted by the climate crisis to these spaces if you're not even doing the bare minimum, which is reaching them through the language, right? And not just the language as in translation, but accessible language, talking to real people about the real problems. So that inspired me to take action. And nowadays with EmpoderaClima, we still continue to do a lot of this translation work, really reaching people at the local levels, but also empowering them through educational tools, mentorship programs, and we can talk more about it. But I think at the end of the day, it is about people, but if we don't bridge those gaps and really bring the most important people in terms of the most affected people, the most vulnerable people to the high-level decision-making spaces, we're not going to solve climate. We're not going to do our job right. And I think that's what we've seen over the years. The lack of diversity has resulted in a lack of action. And so my hope is that more and more we can see youth negotiators, women leading diplomatic teams, leading the UN, leading a lot of these spaces where the decisions are being made.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. This is the first time I've been in Seattle since I lived here in summer of 2019. So like everyone here, gender justice is so crucial to climate. So if we actually go into breaking down what the connections between gender and climate are, We understand that women experience the climate crisis with disproportionate severity because our basic rights continue to be infringed upon in varying set of degrees around the world. And when we take a step further, we understand that racialized women, Black and Indigenous women in particular, bear an even heavier burden because of the historic and continuing impacts of systemic racism, colonialism, imperialism, the list goes on. And I also think it's really important for us to put an asterisk here. The majority, if not all, of the scholarship on gender and climate looks at gender from a very explicit binary and leaves out our gender expansive kin, and that is extremely problematic and also tells us that there are other folks that are experiencing the climate crisis at disproportionate rates that aren't even being seen as human enough to be included in research. So Black Girl Environmentalist is really looking at this issue of pathway and retention in the climate sector, particularly for Black women. People of color make up nearly 40% of the US population, but we don't exceed a 12 to 16% green ceiling. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. And Black women in particular have amongst the lowest retention rate. That's problematic from an equity point of view. It's also problematic when it comes to creating a climate community that is robust enough to create solutions that actually impact the most marginalized and then also the rest of us. So Black Girl Environmentalist is creating those pipelines, and we are creating ecosystems of care for the next generation of Black women climate leaders. We do this through 3 impact areas: green workforce development, narrative change, and community empowerment, and all of our programming falls under those 3. I won't bore you with all of our programming, but one of our programs that is happening right now is our Hazel M. Johnson Fellowship Program, which is named after the mother of environmental justice, who is a community organizer from the great city of Chicago. That is a program that is working to provide climate internships and adequate funding and resourcing to Black women and Black gender expansive college students and recent graduates. So we have partnered up with 12 partner organizations around the country. One of them is the Beyond Petrochemicals campaign. We have Hip Hop Caucus. We have Harvard Salata Institute. We have RARE. We have Regulatory Assistance Project. We actually have 3 of our fellows here today. And while those folks are at these internships for 10 weeks, we have negotiated that they receive at least $18 an hour wage. On top of that, Black Girl Environmentalist provides them a $5,000 relocation and living wage stipend to ensure that the barriers that often keep young folks of color from accessing green internships is alleviated. We also provide 3 hours of professional development each week, in addition to an end of summer retreat that we're actually going to be having in Washington State. We have a college mentorship program that focuses on connecting 15 current college students. Over half of them are from community colleges and HBCUs, with senior level Black women who meet with them on a bi-weekly basis to support them in their careers, etc. So we're really trying to resource the next generation, love on them, really provide the resources for them to really grow in their leadership in the climate space. And yeah.
That's great, and I love how you brought up that the gender climate battle is not just binary, obviously. That was really interesting what you said about the green ceiling, and climate work, at the end of the day, it's still work. There are still structures and organizations and hierarchies and barriers to entry. And just like in every other industry, certain demographics have advanced higher than others and hold much more power than others. And I was really interested in that. I wondered if you could elaborate on the green ceiling. How do you define it, and how have you encountered it, and how are you trying to make sure that more and more people can break through?
Yeah, so essentially the green ceiling goes back to that statistic that I was talking about regarding the disparities between the amount of people of color in this country and the ways that we're not adequately represented in the green economy space. It's really, really troubling, right? Like, our movement has been assigned the grand task of solving the greatest crisis of all time. We also know that people of color are quite literally experiencing the brunt of the issues, and yet we are not represented in leadership. I say this all the time: the climate crisis is a poly crisis. We all know this. It's an ecological crisis. We're experiencing and seeing ecological breakdown. It's also a narrative crisis. We don't know how to talk about it properly. It's also a leadership crisis because there's not enough women, there are not enough people of color, and we are not creating pipelines to support the next generation early career individuals. And the most important early career individuals to get in this space our youth of color, our Black and Indigenous youth, and that simply isn't happening. And so whenever I think about Black Girl Environmentalists, we have a full-time staff of 3 individuals and some part-time staff, and we are a completely Gen Z organization. And we've been able to create a pipeline program that's supporting 14 individuals. And yes, it's not like 100 individuals, but we're doing a really good job, at least to me, in supporting those folks in our cohorts. And I see all these organizations with huge endowments that have so much money, that have expendable staff, that say that they care about diversifying their staff, and when push comes to shove, their retention rates aren't great. So my question for everyone is, what are we doing to actually integrate pipelines within the organizations that you have, or working with organizations like Black Girl Environmentalist, Green Jobs Board, Black Oak Collective, the list goes on, who are doing that hard work. So partnerships and all that stuff is important.
Yeah, and Renata, we talked about how you have had similar experiences and, being in the room, being taken seriously. How have you dealt with that?
Definitely. I think at the heart of the gender climate debate, battle, I think about ecofeminism, this concept that the destruction and the degradation of nature that we have been doing for so long is directly associated to the violence against women and to what we have been doing to women in our society. So it's deeply interconnected into this patriarchal system, right? So I think when I think of the green ceiling, it is a systemic issue, right? It's who gets to access the resources to then get the jobs in renewable energy, for example. It's why we see less women that sometimes are working as engineers or in the environmental sector. It's not because of talent. We know that there's a lot of really amazing women out there. It's truly lack of opportunity, right? Lack of being able to access these spaces. And I mentioned language before. I think that's the first one when we think about the Global South and how the US is not the center of the world. There's so many countries that speak other very rich languages but are not able to really break that barrier, access those spaces because of lack of opportunities in that area. And you see these in the COP spaces, for example, as well, where they're held, right? Who can access them as youth activists. As I said, I've been going to COPs for almost 10 years. Every single year, it's a struggle. With all of my privilege, with all of my access, I have to rush for funding, and I often get it maybe 4 days before COP, because it's so hard to get funded in these spaces. And at EmpoderaClima, a lot of us are still volunteers because it's really hard in Brazil, in Latin America, in the Global South, everywhere, as a youth civil society organization, to make ends meet. A lot of us have main jobs, a lot of us are in school, and that's why oftentimes you don't then see those people that should be at the forefront of the decision-making spaces there, because they have to take care of their families, they have to work to get money to eat, right? So there's so many layers in this patriarchal system that we live in that it's hard to even begin to approach it. But the way that we've decided to approach it at EmpoderaClima has a lot to do with education. Knowledge equals empowerment. So this idea that if we start educating young people, specifically young girls, about the importance of climate action, what can they do if they're living in a community, in a neighborhood that's facing a climate disaster? A lot of people don't know. My home state in the south of Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, just faced its worst climate disaster in history. I can't go home now. My airport is flooded, closed until the end of the year. This is real life, right? And you're seeing who's able to adapt quicker. You're seeing women that are left at homes, abandoned by their husbands in light of a climate disaster. You're seeing women being abused in the shelters in face of a climate disaster. So this is a very tangible, real issue. So we need to start changing our systems, changing our school curriculums, changing the ways that we hire people in the jobs to really make and create spaces and opportunities for these people that are at the front of the climate crisis to be able to go up, to be empowered to access these spaces. Because again, they have the talent, they're just missing that one opportunity to get there, to get to those spaces.
Yeah, and speaking of COP, next year is going to be a big one for your home country in Brazil. You're going to host the COP. I'm sure you're already thinking about using that as an opportunity. What plans are you making?
Definitely. I think that's actually a really exciting thing. At the end of the day, we don't revolve around COP, right? Or we shouldn't. But of course, it's really exciting when you have the biggest space for climate negotiations in your home country, but not also just in my home country, but in Latin America. COP25 was supposed to be in Chile, but it was moved to Madrid at the last minute. So it's been a long time coming that we've been waiting to have a COP in Latin America. And the meaning of that is so deep. It's not just about hosting it there. It's about who can get access to that, right? Because we all know how difficult it is to get visas to a lot of countries. And so even in the COVID-19 pandemic, when COP26 was held in the UK, a lot of activists couldn't go either because of visas or even the vaccine, because their countries hadn't been able to get vaccinated yet. And so you start to see the structural inequalities even in that, even in the people that can actually be there, hear of what's going on, raise their voices, use their voices. And so super, super meaningful that COP is happening in Brazil, but more than that, it's happening in the Amazon, in Belém. And so I think it's really important to highlight, even for us Brazilians, we are doing our best to highlight Amazonian voices and make sure that this is specifically their COP. This is the time that the people that are the guardians of our earth, that have been working for this for centuries, then now finally have the spotlight that they deserve. Because I think when I talk about gender and climate in a lot of spaces, people think it's so cool and new and innovative. Honestly, in indigenous spaces, collective action and feminist action has been happening for centuries, right? It's oftentimes women that are the leaders of their communities. And so bringing COP to the Amazon will have a really deep meaning. But I think it's important that we prepare well, that we have the funding to then be prepared to attend the COPs. They're, again, really difficult spaces to be in. And so from our side, from EmpoderaClima, we've launched a project just very recently called Empoderando pelo Clima, Empowering for the Climate, with this idea that we're choosing 15 young women who are not your usual suspects for climate activism, right? We know the people that always get to access the same spaces, but we need people that are passionate, but again, are waiting for that one opportunity. And so this program is choosing 3 young women from all the 5 regions of Brazil so that we can encompass all the different biomes and people that, again, are waiting for that one opportunity, and we're bringing them public policy training, media training, personal branding, all the skills that are not your obvious skills, right? We can teach young people, young women about climate change and climate policies, but we need to go beyond that if we want to really change the game, change the scenarios, change the people that are the negotiators of our countries. And so we're doing that this year with the idea that we can then expand and bring these young women, then empower, then with the education and the skills, the knowledge base to access these spaces next year. So it's just a pilot program, but the idea is with more funding, with more support, we can empower more young women of Brazil, of Latin America to get there.
And speaking of funding, that's a major issue for both of you. It's like you say, it's all systemic. It's who gets in the room, but also who gets funded in order to do the programs that both of you are trying to get off the ground. I mean, Wawa, how do you deal with that disparity, and how are you trying to change that?
Yeah, I would say it's not a hot take to say that philanthropy is still pretty antiquated. Getting funding, we're all trying to get money, right? And it's very hard when you are an organization that it's run by women. We know that women receive like 2%, at least in the US, 2% of climate-led organizations that are led by women receive 2% of funding. Those percentages go down when it's women of color-led. Youth-led organizations receive 0.76% of climate philanthropy. The Youth Climate Justice Fund folks are out here who are helping to revolutionize that, so you should go check them out. And it's a huge issue, right? Because if we're talking about the youth-led organization end of things, folks are always looking at Gen Z. They're looking at our generation, and they're saying that, y'all are gonna save us, and you go ahead and do that, but with what resources, right? People are already creating solutions as a means of survival. I see it happening all the time, but folks are doing it with such little resources. Folks are scraping by, most folks are volunteer, and so I always think about what those climate solutions could look like if they were actually properly financed and if they were actually valued as being legitimate expertise. So I would say you should, if you can, open your pocketbook and support youth-led organizations, or amplify folks. Bring organizations and their names into rooms that are often very difficult for us to get into, because those are the paradigms that we need to change if we actually want to solve this crisis.
That's great. I'm genuinely so happy that we got to have this conversation in this forum with this group of people, and I thank you so much for giving us your time. Thank you.